The blood-stained water swirled around Julia's legs as she clutched her newborn baby to her chest, shivering from the cold mountain creek that had been her only companion during childbirth. The early morning light of spring 1875 filtered through the pines of the Colorado wilderness, illuminating her tears as they mixed with the clear water rushing past her. She had nothing but the soaked dress on her back and the tiny bundle in her arms, abandoned by the man who had promised her the world only to leave her to die when she needed him most. Julia's body ached with exhaustion and pain. Just hours earlier, she had been traveling west with Thomas, the charming gambler who had swept her off her feet in St. Louis. When her water broke unexpectedly on the trail, he had helped her down from their wagon, promised to fetch help, and never returned. As dawn broke, the terrible reality settled upon her. He had taken everything they owned and abandoned her. "Hush now, little one," she whispered to her whimpering baby, trying to shield the infant from the morning chill. Her arms trembled as she tried to stand, but her legs gave way beneath her, sending her back down into the shallow creek. "We'll find a way," she promised, though she had no idea how to fulfill those words. The soft crunch of leaves and the distant whinny of a horse made Julia's heart race with both hope and fear. She clutched her baby tighter, ready to defend her child against whatever threat approached. "Hello," a deep voice called out. "Anybody there?" Julia hesitated, fear making her mute as hoofbeats grew closer. Then a tall figure on horseback emerged from the trees, silhouetted against the rising sun. He dismounted swiftly, revealing a rugged face beneath the wide brim of his worn Stetson. "Madam." The stranger approached cautiously, his eyes widening as he took in the scene before him: a young woman sitting in a creek, clutching a newborn baby, both of them soaked and shivering. "Please," Julia finally managed, her voice cracking. "My baby." Without hesitation, the man shrugged off his heavy duster coat and waded into the creek. "Name's Samuel Blackwood," he said gently, draping the warm coat around her shoulders. "Let's get you and the little one out of this water." The coat enveloped Julia like a sanctuary, bringing the first warmth she had felt in hours. The scent of leather, tobacco, and horses surrounded her, smells that would forever after represent safety in her mind. "Can you stand, madam?" Samuel asked, his voice low and steady. "I tried," Julia admitted. "My legs won't hold." With careful movements, Samuel knelt beside her. "May I?" he asked, extending his arms. Julia nodded, and he scooped her up, baby and all, as if they weighed nothing. His arms were strong and sure as he carried them to the bank and set her down gently on a patch of soft grass. "My camp's not far," he said, assessing her condition with worried eyes. "Got food, clean water, and a fire going." Julia looked down at her baby, then back at the kind face of the cowboy. "Why would you help us?" she asked, suspicion born from betrayal making her voice sharp. Samuel's expression softened. "Madam, where I come from, you don't leave folk in need, especially not a mother and child." He glanced around. "Your husband nearby?" The word husband triggered fresh tears. "No husband," she said bitterly. "Just a man who made promises he never intended to keep." Understanding flickered in Samuel's eyes. "I see." He stood and whistled, bringing his chestnut mare trotting obediently to his side. "Can you hold on to that little one while I get you up on Penny here?" Julia nodded, clutching her baby with one arm, while Samuel helped her mount his horse. He adjusted his coat around her shoulders and the baby, ensuring they were covered. "What's your name, madam?" he asked, taking Penny's reins and leading them away from the creek. "Julia," she replied, her voice barely audible over the babbling water. "Julia Parker. And this is—" she hesitated, looking down at the tiny face of her daughter. "This is Hope." Samuel nodded, a small smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Hope. That's a good name for a baby born under such circumstances." As they moved through the trees, Julia fighting to stay conscious, she noticed the way Samuel kept glancing back at her and the baby, concern etched on his weathered face. Despite her situation, a small feeling of security began to bloom in her chest. This stranger, this cowboy with kind eyes, had done more for her in a matter of minutes than Thomas had in their entire relationship. "We're almost there," Samuel assured her as they rounded a bend in the trail. "Just hold on a little longer." Julia nodded weakly, her arms tightening around baby Hope. The world around her began to blur, exhaustion and blood loss taking their toll. The last thing she remembered before darkness claimed her was the gentle way Samuel looked at her and the warmth of his coat against her skin. When Julia regained consciousness, she was lying on a bedroll beside a crackling fire. Her clothes had been replaced with a dry flannel shirt that swallowed her frame, and her baby was bundled beside her in what appeared to be a clean saddle blanket. "You're awake," Samuel's voice came from across the fire. He set down the coffee pot he was holding and moved to her side. "How are you feeling?" Julia pushed herself up on her elbows, wincing at the pain that shot through her body. "Alive," she answered honestly. "Thanks to you." Samuel shook his head. "You're strong, Miss Parker. Most women wouldn't have survived what you went through." He handed her a tin cup of water. "Your little one's been sleeping peacefully. Fed her some sugar water while you were out. Not ideal, but it'll do until—" He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the implications of how an infant would normally be fed. Julia took the cup with trembling hands. "How long was I unconscious?" "About 3 hours," Samuel replied. "I was starting to worry." She sipped the water, feeling its coolness soothe her parched throat. "You saved our lives," she said simply. Samuel shrugged, his broad shoulders shifting beneath his cotton shirt. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Julia said firmly. "They wouldn't have." She looked down at her sleeping baby. "What happens now? Where are we?" "We're about 15 miles outside of Silverdale," Samuel explained, returning to his spot across the fire. "It's a small mining town where I've been working as a ranch hand for the past year. Not much to look at, but they've got a doctor and decent folk." He hesitated. "If you'd like, I can take you there tomorrow, once you've rested." Julia considered her options, which were painfully few. She had no money, no possessions, and nowhere to go. "I'd be grateful," she finally said. Samuel nodded, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Got some stew cooking. Nothing fancy, but it's hot and filling." The smell of the simmering pot made Julia's stomach growl loudly, reminding her that she hadn't eaten in over a day. Samuel smiled at the sound and ladled a generous portion into a tin plate for her. As Julia ate, she studied her rescuer in the firelight. Samuel Blackwood was not a young man, perhaps in his mid-30s, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting in the sun. His dark hair was streaked with silver at the temples, and a scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into a neatly trimmed beard. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way that Thomas had been, but there was something compelling about his face, a kind of steady reliability that put her at ease. "You've been out here alone long?" she asked between bites. Samuel added a log to the fire. "Headed back from delivering some horses to a ranch north of here. Taking my time about it." He glanced at her. "Lucky thing I was." "Lucky indeed," Julia agreed, looking down at Hope. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found us." "Best not to dwell on what didn't happen," Samuel advised. "You focus on getting your strength back. That little one needs you healthy." As if on cue, Hope began to stir, her tiny face scrunching up before letting out a hungry cry. Julia set aside her plate and gathered her daughter into her arms, her body responding naturally to the infant's needs despite her weakened state. Samuel stood abruptly. "I'll, give you some privacy," he said, his weathered face flushing slightly. "Going to check on Penny and make sure everything's secure for the night." Julia appreciated his discretion as she tended to her daughter. By the time Samuel returned, Hope was sleeping again, and Julia was fighting to keep her own eyes open. "You should rest," Samuel said, noticing her exhaustion. "We've got a long ride tomorrow." Julia nodded, settling back onto the bedroll with Hope nestled against her. "Mr. Blackwood," she said softly as he prepared his own sleeping area on the opposite side of the fire. "Thank you for everything." Samuel tipped his hat in acknowledgement. "Get some sleep, Miss Parker. Morning comes early out here." As Julia drifted off, the last thing she saw was Samuel's silhouette against the starry night sky, keeping watch over them both. The journey to Silverdale the next day was slow and careful. Samuel fashioned a sling from a spare shirt so that Julia could carry Hope securely while riding behind him on Penny. Every hour or so, he would stop to let Julia rest and tend to the baby. His gentleness and patience never wavered, even when their progress slowed to a crawl. "Tell me about Silverdale," Julia said as they rode through a meadow filled with wildflowers. What kind of place is it? Samuel adjusted his hat against the midday sun. Started as a silver mining camp about 10 years ago. Most of those played out, but there's still enough business to keep the town alive. Got about 500 folks living there now, miners, ranchers, shopkeepers. It's rough around the edges, but there's good people there. And you work on a ranch? Julia asked, trying to piece together the life of this man who had so unexpectedly become her savior. The Circle B, Samuel confirmed. Owned by Gerald Byrne. Good man, fair employer. I break horses, drive cattle, fix what needs fixing. He paused. Been at it most of my life, one ranch or another. No family. Julia ventured, then immediately regretted the personal question. I'm sorry, that's none of my business. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Had a wife once, he finally said, his voice low. Sarah. Lost her and our unborn child to fever 8 years ago. He cleared his throat. Been on my own since then. The simple tragedy of his words made Julia's heart ache. I'm sorry, she said softly, unconsciously tightening her grip around his waist. Life goes on, Samuel replied. But there was a wealth of unspoken grief in those 3 words. They fell into companionable silence as the trail narrowed, winding through a pine forest. Hope slept peacefully in her sling, lulled by the gentle motion of the horse. By late afternoon, the first buildings of Silverdale came into view, a collection of wooden structures stretching along a single main street, with scattered homes and businesses climbing the hillside above. Not much to look at, Samuel said apologetically as they approached. To Julia, who had spent the last several months traveling with Thomas through increasingly remote territories, the small town looked like a metropolis. It has walls and roofs, she said with a tired smile. That's enough for me right now. Samuel guided Penny down the main street, nodding to those who called out greetings. Julia felt eyes on her, curious glances and whispers following their progress. She pulled Samuel's coat tighter around herself and the baby, suddenly aware of how she must appear a disheveled woman in oversized men's clothing, riding behind a cowboy. They stopped in front of a modest 2-story building with a sign that read, Dr. Matthew Wilson, physician and surgeon. Doc Wilson's a good man, Samuel said as he helped Julia dismount. Served as an army surgeon during the war. Knows what he's doing. Julia clutched Hope to her chest, suddenly nervous. I don't have any money to pay him. Samuel waved away her concern. Don't you worry about that. Doc and I have an understanding. Before Julia could question what that meant, the door opened, and a slender man with spectacles and a neat gray beard stepped out onto the porch. Samuel Blackwood, the doctor said, his eyes quickly taking in the scene. What trouble have you found this time? Samuel removed his hat respectfully. Doc Wilson, this is Julia Parker and her daughter Hope. They've had a rough couple of days and could use your expertise. The doctor's expression softened as he looked at Julia and the baby. Of course. Please, come in. He held the door open, ushering them into a clean, simply furnished office. I'll leave you in Doc's capable hands, Samuel said, remaining on the threshold. Need to report back to the ranch and take care of Penny. Panic flared in Julia's chest at the thought of being left alone in this strange town. Will you? She began, then stopped herself, embarrassed by her neediness. Samuel seemed to understand her unspoken fear. I'll be back this evening to check on you both, he promised. And we'll figure out next steps then. Relief washed over Julia. Thank you, she said simply. With a tip of his hat, Samuel was gone, leaving Julia to face the doctor's gentle but thorough examination. True to his word, Samuel returned just after sunset, bringing with him a bundle of clothing and other necessities. By then, Julia had been installed in a small room above the doctor's office, clean and properly dressed in a borrowed nightgown, with Hope sleeping in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a drawer. Doc says you're both doing remarkably well, considering the circumstances, Samuel said, setting his parcels on a chair. Though he recommends at least a week of rest before you travel anywhere. Julia sat up in bed, her damp hair braided over one shoulder. You've spoken to him about my situation? Samuel nodded. Hope that's all right. Thought it best he know the full story. He gestured to the bundles he'd brought. Got you some things from the general store. Nothing fancy, but clean clothes that should fit, some baby things. Mrs. Byrne at the ranch sent along a nightgown and some other lady items. Julia was overwhelmed by this kindness. How can I ever repay you for all this? Samuel shook his head. No need for that kind of talk. Just focus on getting well. He shifted uncomfortably. There is the matter of where you'll go after you're recovered. The question hung in the air between them. Julia had been avoiding thinking about it, focusing instead on the immediate needs of herself and her baby. I don't know, she admitted. I have no family left. My parents died 2 years ago, and I have no siblings. She twisted the blanket between her fingers. Thomas, the baby's father, he took everything. Our wagon, our money, everything we owned. Samuel's jaw tightened at the mention of the man who had abandoned her. Well, he said after a moment, there might be a solution, at least temporarily. Julia looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. Mrs. Byrne at the Circle B has been looking for help with the housekeeping and cooking, Samuel explained. She's getting on in years, and the ranch hands keep her busier than she'd like. It's not much room, board, and a small wage, but it would give you and Hope a roof over your heads while you decide what's next. You'd do that for me? Julia asked, her voice breaking. Recommend me for a position when you barely know me? Samuel's expression was serious. I know enough. I know you survived giving birth alone in a creek. I know you're thinking of your child first. And I know that anyone who's been dealt the hand you have deserves a fair chance to play it. He paused. Besides, Mrs. Byrne would have my hide if she found out I didn't offer to help. Julia laughed softly, the first genuine laugh since before Hope's birth. Then I accept, Mr. Blackwood. Gratefully. Samuel's face relaxed into a smile. Good. I'll let Mrs. Byrne know. She'll be pleased to have another woman around the place. As he turned to leave, Julia called out, Samuel? The informal use of his name felt strange on her lips, but somehow right. He looked back, eyebrows raised in question. Thank you, she said simply. For everything. Samuel nodded once, a gesture that conveyed more than words could have. Rest well, Julia. I'll come by tomorrow. As the door closed behind him, Julia looked down at her sleeping daughter. Well, Hope, she whispered. It seems we found a guardian angel in a cowboy hat. The week of recovery passed quickly. Samuel visited daily, bringing news from the ranch and small gifts, a handmade wooden rattle for Hope, a book of poetry for Julia, fresh baked goods from the town's bakery. Each visit lasted longer than the one before, as they gradually shared pieces of their lives with one another. Julia told him about growing up as the daughter of a bookbinder in St. Louis, about her love of literature and how she had dreamed of becoming a teacher before meeting Thomas. Samuel shared stories of his years on various ranches across the West, of cattle drives and wild horses, of the beauty and harshness of the land he loved. They carefully avoided certain topics, Thomas, for Julia, and Sarah, for Samuel, but even in these omissions, a bond of understanding grew between them. By the time Dr. Wilson declared Julia fit to travel to the ranch, a tentative friendship had formed, built on mutual respect and the unique circumstances that had brought them together. The Circle B Ranch sprawled across several hundred acres of rolling hills and meadows, with the main house and outbuildings nestled in a valley protected from the worst of the winter winds. As Samuel drove the borrowed wagon up the long drive, Julia took in the sight of her new home with a mixture of anxiety and hope. The main house was a solid 2-story structure of weathered wood and stone, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the windows glowed with welcoming light in the late afternoon sun. It's beautiful, Julia said, cradling Hope against her shoulder. Samuel smiled, pleased by her reaction. Wait until you see the view from the back porch at sunset. Nothing like it in all of Colorado. As the wagon rolled to a stop in front of the house, the front door opened, and an older woman emerged, wiping her hands on an apron. Martha Byrne was a formidable figure despite her diminutive stature, straight-backed and sharp-eyed, with silver hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. So this is our new housekeeper, she said, her gaze taking in Julia and the baby with shrewd assessment. Samuel's told us about your situation, dear. Terrible business, being abandoned like that. Julia stiffened, uncomfortable with her personal tragedy being discussed so openly, but Mrs. Byrne continued without pause. Well, you're here now, and that's what matters. The good Lord works in mysterious ways. bringing you to our doorstep just when I was about at my wits' end trying to manage this place with nothing but menfolk underfoot." She gestured to Samuel. "Bring in her things, Samuel. I've prepared the blue room for her and the little one." Samuel helped Julia down from the wagon with gentle hands, then gathered her few possessions. Julia followed Mrs. Byrne into the house, trying to absorb everything at once: the comfortable, well-worn furniture, the polished woodwork, the smells of baking bread and coffee. "My husband Gerald is in town on business," Mrs. Byrne explained as she led Julia upstairs. "You'll meet him at supper. The men eat in the bunkhouse, but Samuel takes his meals with us in the main house, being the foreman." Julia paused on the stairs. "Samuel is the foreman?" She looked back at him, surprised by this new information. Samuel shrugged, seeming almost embarrassed. "Should have mentioned that, I suppose." Mrs. Byrne chuckled. "Modest to a fault, this one. Best horseman and ranch manager in 3 counties, but you'd never hear it from him." She continued up the stairs. "Now, the blue room has a nice cradle that Gerald built for our son 40 years ago. It's been gathering dust in the attic, but I had the boys bring it down and polish it up for your little one." The blue room was small but charming, with faded floral wallpaper and a large window overlooking the mountains. The promised cradle stood beside a narrow bed, its wood gleaming with care. "It's perfect," Julia said sincerely, touched by the thoughtfulness. Mrs. Byrne nodded, satisfied. "Good. I'll leave you to get settled. Supper's at 6 sharp." She paused at the door. "Samuel says you're a quick learner and not afraid of hard work. That's all I need to know for now. The rest will sort itself out in time." After the older woman left, Samuel set Julia's bundles on the bed. "Mrs. Byrne can seem a bit abrupt," he said apologetically, "but she's got a heart of gold under that stern exterior. She reminds me of my grandmother." Julia replied with a small smile. "All business on the outside, all love on the inside." Samuel nodded, pleased by her understanding. "Well, I should let you get settled." He moved toward the door, then hesitated. "Julia, I want you to know you're not beholden to stay here if it doesn't suit you. If you decide you want to move on, just say the word. I'll help you get wherever you want to go." The sincerity in his eyes made Julia's throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you, Samuel. But right now, this feels like exactly where Hope and I need to be." A smile spread across his face, warming his features. "I'm glad to hear that. Real glad." As he closed the door behind him, Julia sat on the edge of the bed, looking around at the small, clean room that was now their home. For the first time since Hope's birth, she felt a sense of possibility unfurling within her, not just of survival, but of building something new. Life at the Circle B quickly fell into a rhythm. Julia rose early each morning to help Mrs. Byrne prepare breakfast for the ranch hands. While Hope napped, she tackled the cleaning and mending that kept the main house running smoothly. In the afternoons, she assisted with the cooking and learned the intricacies of managing a ranch household. Mrs. Byrne proved to be a patient teacher, and Mr. Byrne, a jolly man with a booming laugh and kind eyes, treated Julia with grandfatherly affection. Both doted on Hope, often insisting on watching the baby so Julia could have moments of rest. Samuel was a constant, steady presence. Though his duties as foreman kept him busy from sunrise to sunset, he always found time to check on Julia and Hope. Sometimes it was just a brief greeting as he passed through the kitchen for coffee. Other times, he would linger after supper, entertaining them all with stories of his adventures across the West. Julia began to notice the small, thoughtful gestures: wildflowers appearing on the kitchen windowsill, a rocking chair mysteriously showing up on the back porch, fresh fish from the stream delivered to the kitchen just as Mrs. Byrne mentioned wanting some for supper. Samuel never drew attention to these kindnesses, but Julia knew their source. As spring blossomed into early summer, Hope grew stronger each day, her chubby cheeks and bright eyes a delight to everyone on the ranch. Julia, too, flourished in this new environment, regaining not just her physical strength, but something of her former spirit as well. One evening in late June, after Hope had been put to bed and the Byrnes had retired for the night, Julia found Samuel sitting alone on the back porch, staring out at the mountains bathed in the golden light of sunset. "May I join you?" she asked, stepping through the door with 2 cups of coffee. Samuel stood immediately, taking one of the cups from her. "Of course." They sat side by side on the porch swing, a comfortable silence stretching between them as they watched the sun sink lower behind the distant peaks. "You were right," Julia said eventually. "About the view. I've never seen anything so beautiful." Samuel nodded, his eyes still on the horizon. "Been all over this country, seen things most folks only read about in books. But this view right here, it's what I think of when I think of home." "How long have you worked for the Burns?" Julia asked, sipping her coffee. "Going on 5 years now," Samuel replied. "Came here after drifting for a while following Sarah's passing." He said his late wife's name carefully, as if testing whether it still caused him pain. "The Burns, they gave me more than just a job. Gave me a purpose again." Julia understood all too well the need for purpose after loss. "They're good people." "The best," Samuel agreed. "Treat their hands like family. Treated me like a son when I needed it most." He glanced at her. "They think highly of you, you know." "Mrs. Burns says the house hasn't run this smoothly in years." Julia felt a flush of pleasure at the praise. "I'm grateful to them for giving Hope and me a chance." The swing creaked gently as they rocked in silence for a few minutes. "Julia," Samuel began, his voice low and serious. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you." Her heart quickened inexplicably. "Yes. The town's having their Independence Day celebration next week. Picnic, dancing, fireworks, the whole business." He stared down into his coffee cup. "Thought you might like to go? You and Hope, I mean. Get to know some of the other folks around here." Julia had met few people outside the ranch in her months at Circle B. The prospect of a social gathering was both appealing and intimidating. "That sounds nice," she said carefully. Samuel nodded, still not meeting her eyes. "Good. That's good." He cleared his throat. "Thought maybe I could escort you, if you'd like." The formal phrasing made Julia smile. "I'd like that very much, Samuel." He finally looked at her then, relief and something warmer in his gaze. "Good," he repeated, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, painting the sky in vivid pinks and purples, Julia felt a flutter of anticipation in her chest, not just for the upcoming celebration, but for whatever might be growing between her and this quiet, honorable man who had saved her life and asked for nothing in return. The 4th of July dawned clear and bright, with a festive atmosphere permeating the ranch. Mrs. Burns spent the morning preparing dishes for the town picnic, enlisting Julia's help with pies and fried chicken. By early afternoon, the entire household was ready to depart for Silverdale. Julia had spent precious coin from her small savings on fabric to make a new dress for the occasion, a simple but pretty creation of blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes. Mrs. Byrne had helped her style her hair, pinning the thick chestnut waves into a fashionable arrangement adorned with a ribbon that matched her dress. When Samuel saw her descend the stairs with Hope in her arms, he stood transfixed in the foyer, hat in hand, unable to hide his admiration. "You look beautiful," he said simply. Julia felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you." Samuel himself had made an effort with his appearance. His usual work clothes had been replaced with clean dark trousers, a white shirt, and a vest. His hair was neatly combed, and he had trimmed his beard. He looked handsome in a rugged, unpretentious way that made Julia's heart beat a little faster. The journey to town was filled with cheerful conversation. Mr. Byrne regaled them with stories of Independence Day celebrations from years past, while Mrs. Byrne fussed over Hope, who was dressed in a white gown with a tiny red ribbon in her dark curls. Silverdale was transformed for the holiday. Red, white, and blue bunting decorated storefronts, and American flags flew from every building. Tables had been set up in the town square for the community picnic, and a platform stood ready for dancing later in the evening. "Quite the celebration," Julia remarked as Samuel helped her down from the wagon. "Small towns do holidays right," he replied with a smile. "Wait till you taste Mrs. Wilson's apple dumplings. Worth coming just for those." Throughout the afternoon, Samuel stayed close to Julia's side, introducing her to what seemed like every resident of Silverdale. Though initially overwhelmed by meeting so many new people, Julia soon found herself enjoying the friendly atmosphere and genuine welcome she received. "Samuel Blackwood with a lady friend? Never thought I'd see the day," an elderly woman named Mrs. Holbrook teased when they stopped at her table. Samuel took the ribbing good-naturedly. "Mrs. Holbrook, this is Julia Parker and her daughter Hope. They're living at the Circle B now." The old woman's eyes twinkled knowingly. Is that so? Well, Miss Parker, you must be something special. Our Samuel here hasn't escorted a lady to a social function in all the years I've known him. Mrs. Holbrook exaggerates, Samuel said, the tips of his ears reddening. I do no such thing, the woman retorted. And I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper, Samuel Blackwood, so don't you go contradicting me. As they moved on, Julia glanced at Samuel curiously. You grew up around here? He nodded. Born and raised about 20 miles north of here. My father had a small horse ranch. A shadow passed over his face. Lost it after he died. I was 16. I'm sorry, Julia said softly, understanding now why Mrs. Holbrook had known him for so long. Samuel shrugged. It was a long time ago, but Silverdale's the closest thing to home I've had since then. He gestured to a shady spot beneath a large oak. Shall we have our picnic there? They spread a blanket on the grass, and Julia settled Hope on her lap, while Samuel brought plates of food from the communal tables. The baby was a natural conversation starter, drawing admiring comments from passers-by and giving Julia an easy way to engage with strangers. As the afternoon wore on, a small band began to set up on the platform. The first strains of fiddle music filled the air, and couples moved to the dance floor. Would you care to dance? Samuel asked, extending his hand to Julia. She hesitated, looking down at Hope. I shouldn't leave her. Allow me, Mrs. Byrne interjected, appearing beside them. This grandmother-in-waiting has been hoping for a chance to spoil this little one properly. She held out her arms. Go on, you two. Enjoy yourselves. With a grateful smile, Julia transferred Hope to Mrs. Byrne's capable hands and allowed Samuel to lead her to the dance floor. His hand was warm and steady on her waist as they joined the other couples in a lively reel. Julia hadn't danced since before her pregnancy, but her body remembered the steps, and Samuel proved to be a surprisingly graceful partner. You dance well, she commented as they circled each other. Don't sound so surprised, he replied with a grin. Even cowboys have to learn some social graces. They danced through several songs, laughing when they missed steps and growing more in sync with each tune. When the band switched to a slower waltz, Samuel drew her closer, his hand firm at the small of her back. Is this all right? He asked softly. Julia nodded, unable to find her voice as they swayed together under the early evening sky. There was something so right about being in his arms, something that felt like coming home after a long journey. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit around the square, casting a warm glow over the festivities. The music continued, but Samuel noticed Julia glancing toward where Mrs. Byrne sat with Hope. Would you like to check on her? He asked. Julia nodded gratefully. If you don't mind. They found Mrs. Byrne rocking a sleepy Hope beneath a tree. She's been an angel, the older woman assured them. But I think she's about ready for bed. Perhaps we should head back to the ranch, Julia suggested, concerned about keeping her daughter out too late. Nonsense, Mrs. Byrne said firmly. Gerald and I were just discussing taking the wagon back ourselves. We're not as young as we once were, and these old bones have had enough celebrating for one day. She handed Hope to Julia. You two stay for the fireworks. Samuel can bring you both home after. Before Julia could protest, Mr. Byrne appeared with their wagon. It's all arranged, he said cheerfully. Samuel's already saddled his horse for your return journey later. Julia looked at Samuel, who shrugged with a smile. They can be rather determined when they set their minds to something. After the Byrnes departed, Samuel led Julia to a hillside overlooking the town. Best view of the fireworks from here, he explained, spreading his coat on the grass for them to sit on. Hope was already asleep in Julia's arms, undisturbed by the festive noises from the town below. Julia settled on the coat, arranging her daughter comfortably against her chest. Thank you for today, she said as Samuel sat beside her. I can't remember the last time I enjoyed myself so much. In the dim light, she could see his smile. I'm glad. You deserve some happiness, Julia. The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. For a moment, neither spoke, the companionable silence between them filled with unspoken feelings. Julia, Samuel began, his voice low and serious. I want you to know that he was interrupted by the first burst of fireworks, exploding in a shower of red and gold above them. Hope stirred but didn't wake as more fireworks followed, painting the night sky with brilliant colors. Julia gasped in delight, her face illuminated by the spectacle. "They're beautiful." Samuel wasn't watching the fireworks. His eyes remained on Julia, taking in the wonder on her face, the way the colored lights played across her features. "Yes," he agreed softly. "Beautiful." She turned to find him looking at her with such tenderness that her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, hesitantly, Samuel reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Samuel," she whispered, her heart pounding. "I know it's too soon," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You've been through so much, and the last thing I want is to rush you. But I need you to know that I care for you, Julia. For both of you." He glanced down at Hope sleeping peacefully between them. Tears pricked at Julia's eyes. "I care for you too," she admitted. "More than I thought possible." The fireworks continued overhead, but neither noticed as Samuel leaned forward, pausing just inches from her face, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, Julia closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a gentle, questioning kiss. It was brief and sweet, a promise rather than a passion, but when they parted, Julia felt as though something fundamental had shifted between them. Samuel's eyes were bright with emotion as he smiled at her, reaching down to take her free hand in his. They sat together on the hillside, hands entwined, watching the finale of the fireworks burst across the sky. Hope slept on, unaware that her world and her mother's had just changed irrevocably. As summer progressed, Julia and Samuel's relationship deepened, growing from tentative friendship into something more profound. They stole moments together whenever Samuel's duties allowed walks around the ranch property in the evenings, quiet conversations on the porch after Hope was asleep, Sunday afternoons spent picnicking by the stream that ran through Circleby land. Samuel was patient and unhurried, never pushing Julia for more than she was ready to give. He treated Hope with such tenderness that Julia's heart ached watching them together. The baby had begun to recognize him, lighting up with smiles whenever he entered a room, reaching for him with chubby hands. "She adores you," Julia remarked one evening as Samuel rocked Hope on the porch swing. "Feelings mutual," he replied, smiling down at the drowsy infant. "She's a special little girl, just like her mother." By August, Julia had become an indispensable part of the Circleby household. Mrs. Byrne relied on her for everything from meal planning to correspondence, while Mr. Byrne declared her pies to be the finest in the territory. The ranch hands tipped their hats respectfully whenever she appeared, and even the most grizzled cowboys would mind their language when she was present. It was a life Julia had never imagined for herself, but one she had come to cherish. The only shadow on her happiness was the knowledge that she was still, legally, tied to Thomas. Though he had abandoned her, she remained his wife in the eyes of the law, a fact that weighed heavily on her as her feelings for Samuel grew stronger. One warm afternoon, while Hope napped and Mrs. Byrne was visiting a neighbor, Julia sat at the kitchen table writing in the household accounts book. The sound of boots on the porch made her look up, expecting to see Samuel or one of the ranch hands. Instead, a stranger stood in the doorway, a well-dressed man with a city lawyer's bearing and an envelope in his hand. "Miss Parker?" he inquired formally. Julia stood, suddenly anxious. "Yes, I'm Julia Parker." The man stepped forward, extending the envelope. "Henry Taylor, attorney at law. I've been trying to locate you for some time, Miss Parker. I have news regarding your husband." Julia's hand trembled as she took the envelope. "Thomas? What about him?" "I regret to inform you that Thomas Parker was killed in a gambling dispute in Denver last month," the lawyer said, his tone professionally sympathetic. "As his widow, there are certain legal matters that require your attention." Julia sank back into her chair, the news washing over her like a wave. Thomas was dead. The man who had promised to love her, who had fathered her child, who had abandoned them both to die, was gone. "I don't understand," she said finally. "What legal matters?" Mr. Taylor cleared his throat. "It seems that despite his unfortunate character flaws, your husband made certain provisions for you in the event of his death. He purchased a life insurance policy naming you as beneficiary." Julia stared at him in disbelief. "Insurance?" "Yes. The sum is quite substantial, $5,000. The amount was staggering, more money than Julia had ever imagined possessing. "Additionally," the lawyer continued, "he left a letter for you." He removed a sealed envelope from his breast pocket, and placed it on the table beside the insurance documents. Julia stared at it, unable to bring herself to touch it. "How did you find me?" "It wasn't easy," Mr. Taylor admitted. But Mr. Parker had mentioned to associates that his wife was expecting a child and that they had been traveling west. "I've been inquiring at towns along the likely routes for several weeks." Dr. Wilson in Silverdale recalled treating a young woman with a newborn who matched your description. Julia nodded numbly, still trying to process everything. "What happens now?" "The insurance company requires certain documentation proof of your identity and relationship to the deceased. Once provided, the funds will be released to you." He placed a card on the table. "My office is in Denver. When you're ready to proceed, you can contact me there." After the lawyer departed, Julia sat motionless at the table, staring at the letter and documents before her. That was how Samuel found her an hour later when he came in search of a cold drink. "Julia? What's wrong?" he asked, immediately concerned by her pale face and distant expression. Wordlessly, she pushed the lawyer's card toward him. Samuel picked it up, his brow furrowing as he read it. "Henry Taylor, attorney at law," he read aloud, then looked at her questioningly. "Thomas is dead," Julia said flatly. "Killed in a gambling dispute in Denver." Samuel's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, confusion, and something that looked almost like relief before settling into concern for her. "Are you all right?" Julia laughed, a hollow sound without humor. "I don't know what I am. He abandoned me, left me to die, and now he's left me a fortune." She gestured to the documents. $5,000, Samuel. From a man who stole every penny I had." Samuel sat down across from her, taking in the unopened letter. "Have you read what he wrote?" She shook her head. "I'm afraid to. Afraid of what excuses he might offer, what lies he might tell even from the grave." "You don't have to read it now," Samuel said gently. "Or ever, if you don't want to." Julia touched the envelope, tracing her name written in Thomas's elegant script. "No, I need to know. I need to understand why he did what he did." With trembling fingers, she broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. "Julia," she read aloud, her voice wavering. "If you are reading this, then I have met the end I always suspected awaited me. I know that no words can excuse what I did to you and our child. Fear made me a coward. When you went into labor on the trail, I panicked. I told myself I was going for help, but in truth, I was running away from responsibility, as I have run from it all my life. I convinced myself you would be better off without me, that someone would find you, that you would survive as you have always survived the consequences of my failures. The insurance policy was the one decent thing I did taken out when we were first married, in a rare moment of foresight. The money is yours, free and clear. It cannot buy my forgiveness, nor should it. But perhaps it can give you and our child the security I never could. For whatever it is worth, I am sorry. Thomas." Tears streamed down Julia's face as she finished reading. Not tears of grief for the man she had once loved, but for the waste of it all, the pain, the betrayal, the lost chances. Samuel sat quietly, allowing her this moment of reckoning with her past. When she finally looked up, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, he asked softly, "What will you do now?" It was the question Julia had been asking herself since the lawyer's departure. With $5,000, she could go anywhere, do anything. She could move to a city, open a small business, perhaps even pursue her old dream of becoming a teacher. But as she looked at Samuel's face, concerned, supportive, asking nothing for himself, she knew with sudden clarity what she wanted. "I'm going to build a life here," she said simply. "For Hope and for myself." Something like hope flickered in Samuel's eyes. "Here? At Circle B? In Silverdale, at least," she clarified. "It's become home to us. The only real home Hope has ever known." Samuel nodded slowly. "The Wilmer's property on the east side of town has been for sale since old Mr. Wilmer passed. Good house, small but solid. Bit of land with it." He hesitated. "If you were looking for a place of your own, that is." Julia considered this. A house of her own, independence, security for Hope, these were things she had never dared to dream of during the desperate days after Hope's birth. "Would it be very far from here?" she asked, watching Samuel's face carefully. "About 3 miles, he replied. "Not far at all." Julia reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "Samuel, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer." He squeezed her hand gently. Always. If I were to stay in Silverdale, if I were to make a home there for Hope and myself, what would that mean for us? For whatever is growing between us. Samuel's eyes held her steadily. It would mean everything to me, Julia. Everything. He took a deep breath. I love you. Both of you. I think I've loved you since I found you in that creek, holding Hope like she was the most precious thing in the world. The simple declaration brought fresh tears to Julia's eyes. I love you too, she whispered. I've been afraid to admit it, afraid to trust again after Thomas. But I do love you, Samuel. Joy spread across his features, transforming them. Then stay, he said earnestly. Stay and let me court you properly. No rush, no pressure. We'll take all the time you need. Julia nodded, smiling through her tears. I'd like that very much. A cry from upstairs announced Hope's awakening from her nap. Julia stood, still holding Samuel's hand. Would you like to come with me to get her? Samuel rose, bringing their joined hands to his lips and pressing a kiss to her knuckles. I'd be honored. Together they climbed the stairs to where Hope waited, taking the first steps toward the future they would build together. The transformation in Julia's life over the next few months was remarkable. With Thomas's insurance money secured through Mr. Taylor's assistance, she purchased the Wilmer property on the outskirts of Silverdale, a neat two-bedroom house with a spacious kitchen and a porch that wrapped around two sides. The accompanying 3 acres included a small orchard, a kitchen garden, and enough pasture for the milk cow and 2 horses Samuel helped her select. Though she could have afforded hired help, Julia chose to manage her new home herself, finding satisfaction in creating a haven for Hope and herself. She continued to assist Mrs. Byrne at the Circle B several days a week, unwilling to sever the connection to the place and people who had given her a second chance. Samuel courted her with old-fashioned gallantry, bringing flowers when he came to call, taking her on Sunday drives in a buggy borrowed from the ranch, reading to Hope from children's books he ordered specially from Denver. Their relationship deepened with each passing week, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values. By Christmas, Hope was crawling and beginning to pull herself up on furniture, growing stronger and more curious each day. Her first word was Mama, but Sam followed close behind, a fact that filled Samuel with undisguised pride. On Christmas Eve, Julia hosted dinner at her home for the Byrnes and Samuel. The house glowed with candlelight and greenery, and the dining table groaned under the weight of roast goose, mashed potatoes, fresh bread, and Mrs. Byrne's famous mincemeat pies. After the meal, they gathered in the small parlor where a modest pine tree stood decorated with paper stars, strings of cranberries, and a few precious glass ornaments Samuel had brought from the general store. Hope sat on a blanket by the hearth, contentedly playing with a wooden horse Samuel had carved for her. Time for presents, I think, Mr. Byrne announced, his eyes twinkling with anticipation. Mrs. Byrne presented Julia with a beautiful hand-quilted bedspread for her room. Every woman needs something pretty for herself, she said with a knowing smile. The Byrnes gave Hope a set of building blocks and a rag doll with embroidered features. Julia gifted Mrs. Byrne with a lace collar she had spent weeks tatting in secret, and Mr. Byrne received a leather-bound ledger book for the ranch accounts. For Samuel, Julia had knitted a scarf of soft wool in a deep forest green that matched his eyes. To keep you warm on those long rides, she said as he wrapped it around his neck. It's perfect, he replied, touching the careful stitches with appreciation. My turn now. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in silver paper. Julia unwrapped it carefully to reveal a velvet box. Inside nestled a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. When she opened it, she found a tiny photograph of Hope on one side, the other empty. It's beautiful, she breathed, touching the locket reverently. The empty side is for the future, Samuel explained softly. For whatever comes next. The meaning behind his words was clear, and Julia felt her heart swell with emotion. Would you help me put it on? She asked, holding out the necklace. Samuel's fingers were surprisingly deft as he fastened the clasp at the nape of her neck, his touch lingering for a moment against her skin. Julia turned to face him, the locket resting just above her heart. There's one more gift, Samuel said, his voice suddenly serious. He glanced at the Byrnes, who nodded encouragingly. This one's not just for Christmas, though. Julia watched, puzzled, as he moved to kneel before her. When understanding dawned, her hand flew to her mouth. "Julia Parker," Samuel said, his deep voice steady despite the emotion shining in his eyes. "From the moment I found you in that creek with Hope, you've shown me what true courage and strength look like. You've brought joy back into my life when I thought it was gone forever." He took her hand in his. "I love you and Hope more than I ever thought possible. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" From his pocket, he produced a ring, a simple gold band set with a small, perfect diamond that caught the firelight and scattered it like stars. Tears filled Julia's eyes as she looked at this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Samuel, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit as if it had always been meant to be there. Samuel rose and drew her into his arms, kissing her with such tenderness that Julia felt her heart might burst with happiness. The Burns applauded, and even Hope joined in, clapping her hands and giggling at the excitement. Mrs. Byrne dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Mr. Byrne cleared his throat gruffly, clearly moved by the moment. "When?" Julia asked as they finally broke apart, both breathless and smiling. "Whenever you're ready," Samuel replied. "Spring, summer, I'd marry you tomorrow if you'd have me." Julia looked around at the warm room, at Hope playing contentedly by the fire, at the Burns beaming like proud parents, and at Samuel, her rescuer, her friend, her future. February, she decided. On Valentine's Day. It gives us time to prepare, but not so long that we have to wait. Samuel's face lit up with joy. February 14th it is, he agreed, sealing the promise with another kiss. Later, after the Burns had departed with hugs and congratulations, and Hope had been tucked into her crib upstairs, Julia and Samuel stood on the porch, watching snow begin to fall gently in the moonlight. "Are you happy?" Samuel asked, his arm around her waist, holding her close against the winter chill. Julia leaned her head against his shoulder, the events of the past year flowing through her mind, the desperation of Hope's birth, the abandonment, the rescue, and now this new beginning. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she answered truthfully. "It's strange to think that the worst moment of my life led to the best. If Thomas hadn't left us in that creek. If I hadn't decided to take that shortcut home," Samuel added. Julia turned in his arms to face him. "Do you believe in fate, Samuel? That some things are meant to be, no matter how unlikely they seem?" He considered the question seriously, as he did all things. "I believe that good can come from bad situations, if we're brave enough to keep going. And I believe that finding you and Hope was the greatest blessing of my life, however it came about." He kissed her then, a kiss full of promise and commitment, as the snow continued to fall around them, covering the world in a blanket of pristine white, a clean slate for their new beginning. February 14th, 1876 dawned clear and cold, with a brilliant blue sky and sunshine that made the snow-covered landscape sparkle like diamonds. In Julia's bedroom, Mrs. Byrne and several women from town helped her prepare for her wedding day. "You look radiant, dear," Mrs. Byrne said as she pinned a small wreath of white roses and greenery into Julia's upswept hair. Julia studied her reflection in the mirror. Her wedding dress was new, a simple but elegant creation of ivory silk with lace at the collar and cuffs. It had been her one extravagance, ordered from Denver with Mrs. Byrne's assistance. Around her neck hung the locket Samuel had given her at Christmas, now containing a tiny photograph of him alongside Hope's. "I can hardly believe this is happening," Julia confessed, smoothing the fabric of her skirt. "A year ago, I had nothing. Now I have everything." Mrs. Burns squeezed her shoulder affectionately. "You deserve every happiness, my dear. And Samuel, well, he's been waiting for you his whole life, whether he knew it or not." A soft knock at the door preceded Hope's entrance, carried by one of the younger ranch wives. At 14 months, Hope was a sturdy, cheerful toddler with Julia's chestnut curls and a smile that won hearts wherever she went. For the wedding, she wore a dress of pale blue with a white pinafore, a tiny wreath of flowers matching her mother's crowning her curls. "There's my beautiful girl," Julia said, holding out her arms. Hope came to her willingly, babbling happily and patting Julia's face with her small hands. "Mama pretty," she declared, one of the few clear phrases in her expanding vocabulary. Julia hugged her daughter close, overwhelmed with gratitude for this child who had given her the strength to survive when all seemed lost. "Are you ready to see Samuel?" she asked. Hope nodded enthusiastically. "Sam." She agreed, clapping her hands. The Silverdale Church was filled to capacity for the wedding. It seemed that everyone in town and from the surrounding ranches had turned out to witness the union of Samuel Blackwood and Julia Parker. The story of their meeting of the cowboy who had found a mother and newborn abandoned in a creek had become something of a local legend, romanticized with each retelling. Samuel waited at the altar, uncharacteristically nervous in his new suit, his silver-streaked hair neatly combed and his beard trimmed for the occasion. Mr. Burns stood beside him as his best man, offering quiet words of encouragement as they waited. When the church door opened and Julia appeared on Dr. Wilson's arm, the doctor having agreed to give her away in the absence of her father, Samuel felt his breath catch in his throat. She was, without question, the most beautiful sight he had ever beheld. Julia walked slowly down the aisle, her eyes fixed on Samuel's face. Behind her came Mrs. Byrne, carrying Hope, who waved enthusiastically when she spotted Samuel at the altar. The ceremony itself was brief but deeply moving. When the minister asked, "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" Dr. Wilson answered clearly, "She gives herself, with my blessing and that of this community who has come to love her." Samuel and Julia had written their own vows, simple promises exchanged with voices that trembled with emotion. "Julia," Samuel began, holding her hands in his, "I promise to love you and Hope all the days of my life. I promise to be a faithful husband to you and a devoted father to her. I promise to cherish the family we are creating together and to honor the trust you have placed in me. Whatever challenges life brings, we will face them together, with courage and faith and love." Julia blinked back tears as she responded, "Samuel, you found me at my most vulnerable moment and showed me what true strength and kindness look like. I promise to love you with all my heart, to stand beside you in good times and in bad, to build a home and a life with you filled with joy and purpose. I promise to be a wife you can be proud of and to raise Hope to know the depth of your love for her. You are the answer to a prayer I didn't know I was making, and I will be grateful for you every day of our lives together." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel drew Julia into a tender kiss that spoke volumes about his feelings for her. The congregation erupted in applause, and Hope, not to be left out, reached for Samuel from Mrs. Burns' arms. Laughing, Samuel took the toddler, holding her between himself and Julia in their first embrace as a family. "Hello, my darling girl," he said, kissing Hope's forehead. "We're officially a family now." "Family," Hope repeated happily, patting his cheek with one hand and Julia's with the other. The wedding celebration that followed at the Silverdale Town Hall was the most festive event the community had seen in years. Tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes brought by every guest. A fiddle band played lively tunes for dancing, and the newly formed Silverdale Ladies Auxiliary had decorated the hall with evergreen boughs, white ribbons, and paper hearts in honor of Valentine's Day. Julia and Samuel moved through the celebration hand in hand, accepting congratulations and well wishes from friends and neighbors. Julia was struck by how many people had come to care for her and Hope in the relatively short time they had lived in Silverdale, a community that had embraced them without question or judgment. "Mrs. Blackwood," Samuel said as they finally found a moment alone, testing the sound of her new name. "Has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" Julia smiled up at him, still hardly able to believe that this good, honorable man was now her husband. "It's perfect," she agreed, though not quite as perfect as Papa Samuel, which Hope has been practicing. Samuel's eyes widened. "She has." Julia nodded. "Mrs. Byrne has been working with her. She wanted it to be a surprise." The look of pure joy that spread across Samuel's face was something Julia knew she would remember for the rest of her life. In that moment, any lingering doubts she might have harbored about their unconventional beginning vanished completely. This was right. This was meant to be. As the evening drew to a close, Mr. Byrne called for attention, raising his glass in a toast. "To Samuel and Julia," he began, his voice carrying across the hall. "Two people who remind us that even in our darkest moments, Hope can find us. And sometimes, he added with a wink at Hope, who was drowsing in Mrs. Burns' lap, hope comes with a capital H. Laughter and applause followed the toast. And then Samuel led Julia to the center of the floor for one last dance before they departed. As they swayed together to a slow waltz, Julia laid her head against her husband's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Happy, Samuel murmured against her hair. Beyond words, Julia replied. And you? I never thought I'd find this kind of happiness again, he admitted quietly. After Sarah died, I thought that part of my life was over. And then I took that shortcut home from delivering those horses, and everything changed. Julia lifted her head to look into his eyes. I used to wonder why Thomas left us there, why such a terrible thing happened. Now I know it was so we could find you. Samuel kissed her softly. And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it. When the dance ended, they collected a sleepy Hope and said their goodbyes. Samuel had prepared a surprise for their wedding night, a beautifully restored wagon, painted blue and outfitted with comfortable bedding, provisions, and even a small pot-bellied stove to ward off the February chill. We're not going far, he explained as he helped Julia and Hope into the wagon. Just to that piece of land I showed you last week. Thought we might like a night of privacy before heading home. The piece of land was a 5-acre plot adjacent to Julia's property, with a view of both the mountains and the town. Samuel had purchased it secretly as a wedding gift to his new family. I thought maybe in the spring we could start building a proper house there, he said as they arrived, helping Julia down from the wagon. Something with plenty of room for Hope to run, and maybe, for other children, someday. He said this last part cautiously, watching her face for her reaction. Julia's heart swelled with love for this man, who continuously surprised her with his thoughtfulness. I think that sounds wonderful, she said, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. A home built by our own hands, for our family. Hope had fallen asleep during the short journey, and they laid her gently on the bed inside the wagon before stepping back outside to gaze at the stars. Look, Samuel said, pointing upward. A shooting star. Julia followed his gaze, watching the brief, brilliant streak of light across the winter sky. Make a wish, she whispered. Samuel turned to her, taking her face gently between his hands. No need, he said softly. I'm holding everything I've ever wished for right here. As he bent to kiss her under the vast Colorado sky, Julia felt a sense of completion unlike anything she had ever known. From the desperate moments in that creek to this perfect night, her journey had been one of both terrible hardship and extraordinary blessing. Tomorrow, they would begin their life together as husband and wife, as mother and father to Hope, as partners in whatever the future might hold. But tonight, beneath a canopy of stars with their daughter sleeping peacefully nearby, they celebrated the miracle that had brought them together: a cowboy with a kind heart, a woman with unbreakable courage, and the baby whose arrival had set it all in motion. 5 years later, Julia sat on the wide porch of the house Samuel had built for them, watching her children play in the late summer sunshine. Hope, now 6 years old, was showing her younger brother Jacob how to catch grasshoppers in the tall grass that surrounded their home. At 3, Jake was a sturdy, determined little boy with Samuel's green eyes and quiet demeanor. Baby Sarah, just 8 months old and named for Samuel's first wife in a gesture that had moved him to tears, dozed in Julia's arms, her chubby fist curled around the locket that still hung around her mother's neck. The sound of hoofbeats made Julia look up, a smile spreading across her face as Samuel rode into view, returning from his day's work at the Circle B. Though they owned their own land now, with a small but thriving horse breeding operation, Samuel still served as foreman for the Burns, who had become like parents to them both. "Papa!" Hope cried, abandoning her grasshopper hunt to race toward her father. Jake followed as fast as his little legs would carry him, arms outstretched. Samuel dismounted in one fluid motion, scooping both children up and spinning them around as they shrieked with delight. Julia watched, her heart full to bursting with love for this man who had transformed her life in ways she could never have imagined on that desperate day in the creek. As Samuel approached the porch with a child in each arm, his face lit up at the sight of his wife and baby daughter. "There's my beautiful girls," he said, leaning down to kiss Julia softly. "How was your day?" she asked as he settled beside her, setting Hope and Jake down to resume their play. Good. Mr. Byrne finally agreed to retire at the end of the year, Samuel replied, reaching for Sarah, who woke and gurgled happily at the sight of her father. Wants me to take over running the entire operation. Julia squeezed his arm. That's wonderful news. The ranch couldn't be in better hands. Samuel nodded, bouncing Sarah gently on his knee. Means more responsibility, but also more time here at home. Won't have to be on the range as much. He looked out at their property, the neat house with its vegetable garden and flower beds, the small stable where they kept their horses, the creek that ran along the edge of their land. Never thought I'd have all this, he said quietly. Julia followed his gaze, understanding exactly what he meant. From the moment Thomas had abandoned her, she had believed her life was over. Instead, it had been just beginning. Sometimes the worst day of your life can lead to the best, she said, echoing thoughts she had shared with Samuel many times over the years. If I hadn't been left in that creek. If I hadn't found you there, he continued. Then we wouldn't have all this, Julia finished, gesturing to their children, their home, the life they had built together. Samuel shifted Sarah to his shoulder, putting his free arm around Julia and drawing her close. Not a day goes by that I don't thank God for leading me to you and Hope, he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. Best detour I ever took. Julia leaned into his embrace, watching Hope teaching Jake how to make a grass whistle, their laughter carrying on the warm summer breeze. From desperate beginnings had come this abundance of joy, a reminder that sometimes, when all seems lost, rescue comes in unexpected forms. For Julia, it had come in the shape of a cowboy with kind eyes and a warm coat, who had seen a woman and child in need and hadn't hesitated to help. For Samuel, salvation had arrived in the form of a young mother with extraordinary courage and the baby she had named Hope. Together, they had discovered that love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, that family was defined not by blood but by choice, and that sometimes the path to happiness led through the deepest waters. As the sun began to set over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Julia looked at her husband and children, her perfect, improbable family, and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be.